Today on the Perception and Action podcast, the Perception and Action Journal Club number 3, discussing the article, Does the combination of different pitches and the absence of pitch type information influence timing control during batting in baseball? So it's time for our call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I'm joined by Garret Boyum, Hammit and Robert Frey from the Finding the Edge podcast, and Peter Fadde from GameSense Sports to discuss an interesting new article on baseball batting. How does pitch sequencing and advanced knowledge about the pitch type affect the timing of the different stages of a baseball swing? Is it a good idea to try and deliberately train batters to practice being fooled by a pitch? So, hello everyone. Welcome to the Perception and Action Journal Club. Today we're focusing on baseball batting, a new study, very recent study. So I have 4 very knowledgeable baseball people with me. So I'm going to go around the room and let them introduce themselves and tell a little bit about themselves, and we're going to dive into the article. Okay, so I'll start with you, Robert.
Yeah, so my name is Robert Frey. I'm a host on Finding the Edge podcast, and I do a lot of analytics with non-Division I baseball teams. And my focus is trying to showcase those non-Division I college baseball players through analytics.
Nice. So is it kind of like the flat ground?
Essentially, yes. It's kind of like flat ground, where I can tie kind of their video to what they've been doing on the field in terms of performance.
Oh, very nice. Brock?
Yeah, I'm Brock Hammit. I'm currently a minor league development coach for the Milwaukee Brewers. I started Finding the Edge podcast with Garret, and then obviously a big fan of the work that Robert and Peter have done, and you, Rob, as well.
Thank you. Garret?
So I'm Garret Boyum. I'm currently a grad student at Missouri State, and I work with their baseball team there. Also have a podcast and with Brock and Robert called Finding the Edge. And yeah, I also really love the work of both of you guys, and really enjoy the podcast that you do, Rob. So appreciate all the stuff that both you guys contribute to the field.
Thank you very much. And Peter?
Right, and I've talked with Brock and Garret both on the side, just following up out of admiration with one in particular of your episodes. I don't remember the title of it, but it was really diving deep into hitting and what goes on perceptually with that, and of course that's right in your ballpark, Rob. So that's very interesting. It's great to bring up research and kind of get the takes on that. So anxious to see what people are thinking.
Great. And yeah, thank you guys. I really appreciate you joining me. It's much better than talking to myself. So the article we're going to talk about, let me see if I can put it up, is this one. So it's this year article looking at kind of the effects of pitch sequencing and pitch information and they're measuring the timing of the different phases of the swing, which we're all going to get into. But I thought, maybe we can start just kind of your overall general impressions, and maybe we'll go in reverse order here. Peter, what are your thoughts kind of generally about this paper?
Well, that my focus usually is on the front end of that, the pitch recognition aspects. So I really read it hoping that there'd be some insight into what maybe we call tunneling, the combination of pitches, one pitch playing off of another. But when you're coming out of a pitching machine, obviously you're removing exactly those cues that we're interested in. And, so perhaps it's not surprising that they didn't really find a sequencing effect within that. I like to, with the research papers like this, I'm often less looking at the findings and more at like the methods they use, seeing if there are any possible training methods, because researchers, as you know, Rob, don't have all the money in the world, but they do usually have a really fine focus that they're looking for, and they have to figure out a cheap and easy way to get down to that fine focus. So sometimes there are very practical kind of uses in that. And I do see some of that sort of stuff, but I can hold that for a while you discuss it with others.
Okay. Yeah, I get that as well. I always look at, wow, I wish I had those toys to play with sometimes when I read these things. But Garrett?
I thought some things similar to what Peter had to say about the fact that they were using a pitching machine, and too that the pitch velocities were a little bit lower than what you would see at elite levels. And so I thought it was kind of interesting, though, that, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, with the results section, but it seemed as though the pitch type had more of an effect on their timing and their ability to hit it. So I thought that was interesting, that may play a greater role than the actual pitch sequencing.
Yeah. And Brock, what?
Yeah, there's a lot interesting. I think for me, there's the potential that, kind of like Peter was saying, some of the more relevant information that goes into, like, I think what could potentially make pitch sequencing important might not have been present in the study. Particularly the different, like, movement profiles of certain pitches and how, like, scalable they are to actual game, like, competition. And then I think finding that having advanced information being helpful to, like, timing is somewhat intuitive, but I think there were some interesting nuggets to go along with that, specifically how players were able to kind of correct for improper timing by starting their pelvis at a different time. So it's kind of the adjustability piece of hitters that we often talk about.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. Robert?
Yeah, so kind of branching off what Brock says, what I found interesting was the study kind of told these hitters to think fastball and then adjust if you see something different. So I kind of found that interesting because based on the study, there's different, as we'll talk about shortly, there's different type of conditions that they wanted to go through. And I just found it interesting to see that with this kind of sequencing, we tell the batter in this study specifically, always think fastball. So I find that pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. My kind of overall, I think it's interesting from a design point of view, as we'll get into. I think there's some strange choices about how to compare things. Like, for example, telling people to sit on a fastball was kind of a weird choice, I thought. But there's some interesting effects. One thing we'll get to, I think I mentioned this on Twitter. A couple of you alluded to, there doesn't seem to be much of effect of sequencing of pitches, which contradicts one of my findings from like 20 years ago when they called me out in the paper. But we'll see. I think it has something to do with their design more than anything. But I also, like you were saying, Brock, I found the actual timing of the swing phases part kind of interesting. But maybe we'll get in. So if we dive in here, how about I'll go kind of a brief overview of some of the methods, and then you guys can chime in. So basically what they were doing was those were high school players, if I remember.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're hitting off a pitching machine. They had three different conditions. Two of the conditions were batters were told in advance what the pitch was going to be on every pitch. And I don't know, did you guys catch, is it just verbal? Did they just say it's going to be a fastball? I think that's what it was. Did I miss something? I don't know if anyone, I'm pretty sure it was just a verbal indication.
Yeah. I didn't know.
I believe so as well.
Yeah. And so in the first condition, they called the continuity condition. They were told in advance what the pitch was going to be, and then every pitch was the same type in each block. So they're all fastballs, they're all curveballs, they're all slow balls, what they called. And as Garret pointed out, I put the speeds up there. The speeds are really slow. Like this fastball is 76 miles an hour in the study. So they had kind of, you knew what pitch was coming and they're all going to be the same. And then they had this open condition where you knew what pitch was going to be coming, but the sequence was random, which is kind of a strange choice. So that's almost the Houston Astros condition, right? They're being told the pitch is not following any sequence, but they're told in advance what it's going to be coming. And then they had this middle condition where there was no sequence to the pitches. They weren't all the same, and they weren't told ahead of time what their pitch was going to be, but they were told to sit on the fastball. Did I get that? Anyone have any comments about that? Is that kind of the basic, what you got out of that?
I also thought that was interesting that it wasn't like completely random, and that they took pairs and made sure that each of the pairs with different combinations showed up, I believe, an equal amount of times. So it wasn't completely random. It just had the appearance of being random, which I think is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they did that for the analysis, right? So they could they wanted to look at what your effect of the current pitch based on the one before. So if you get two fastballs in a row, does it change your hitting as opposed to getting a curve than a fastball? I think that was the design. So these conditions, for me, this is where I think as a researcher, I would like to have seen a random condition where you didn't tell the people the pitch type, and the random condition where you didn't have to sit on the fastball. And so it's not a very well, you design where you cover all the quadrants of possible combinations of things for me. So it's going to make it hard to know what exactly is going on, I think. But basically, there are two things they're looking for doesn't matter if you know you're informed in advance verbally what the pitch is going to be, and doesn't matter the order, right? So if you hitting a fastball, whether you got a fastball on the previous pitch, those are the two main things they're looking at, right? Does any other things people about the methodology or anything?
I don't know if it's about the methodology as much as maybe the design. I know, Rob, in your earlier study, really it was a matter of probability. And the known condition, if we're concerned about, okay, what are the implications for actual baseball training, then, the known condition, except in the situation that you described, isn't really, in the mix. However, there's what Ted Williams called proper thinking, strategically, or what Reggie Jackson called calculated anticipation. And I know that you were working, in other words, if I remember your study, or one of them anyway, you were giving them a probability that they would get a particular pitch, but then you were especially interested in what happens. And this would have been really nice with the way that they were. I thought the best part of that was they were really getting into those swing mechanics and all in a way that probably wasn't available at the time you did yours. And it's like, okay, what's the effect, and therefore what's the cost benefit? Both basically, it's what's the cost benefit of anticipating this pitch based on what you're told and or the preceding pitch. What happens when that is when that is countered? When you don't get the expected one. Is the swing then so bad that it's not worth the advantage gained in the other, in the anticipated calculation one? And that would bring it a little bit more into the realm of a question that's probably of more concern to Brock, especially as he's thinking, on the ground with hitters, and not being able to say this is what's coming, but what are the effects of a very strong probability, a very strong sense of probability that's coming. So if they had combined your question in that way with their measurements, where they were really trying to look at some of the characteristics of the swing itself, as opposed to contact, or some result of it, then that would be a very interesting combination.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there could have been a lot of interesting things done. There have been some studies that have done this, but for example, one thing interesting you could have looked at was, what does it mean to sit on a fastball in terms of biomechanically? Does it mean you step early? Does it mean you hold your weight back? Does it mean, you load differently? So I thought they could have taken advantage of it. And your point, Peter, I think this kind of sequencing is meaningless. Sequencing really, obviously in real baseball, there's meaningful sequences.
Right. And in this study, probably, Rob, it's the dependent variables that are more interesting than the independent variables. And, that is, how are they actually looking at the effects on the swing, and using some of the kind of modern tools and approaches.
Yeah. And maybe I could put that, I think I have that on the next slide. So I think they used a combination. So the top one is from their paper. The bottom one is from a paper I really like. I'm looking at a lot lately, a study by Katsumata and Human Movement Science in 2007. So I think in this study they used a combination of ground reaction forces and motion tracking, right? Like force plates and motion tracking, right? So the top is showing, they measured when your front foot comes back down to the ground with a force plate. But then they measured like pelvic rotation, I think, with an optical motion tracker, if I'm not mistaken. And then they had a tracker on the bat and things like that. So they're measuring these phases of the different parts of the swing. And I like the one below because it actually shows you how the reaction forces change as you take your front foot off and bring it back down and so on. So, I thought, like, as you said, Peter, these dependent measures, things they're measuring about the swing, I think they had some nice tools and some interesting ways to do it. Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on whether dividing the swing up into these distinct phases makes sense or is useful? Do you think it's a useful thing? A lot of us do it. I do it too. Is it useful, a thing to be doing?
I think it's helpful so that we know which part of the swing we're talking about. But wanted to go back just a little bit on what was interesting with the setup. They covered the pitching machine with like a cloth or something, so they wouldn't be able to tell if they made adjustments. But what's interesting about this, and I think Brock can speak to this, because he was working with Jackson and Brady was working with one of their pitchers, and they had a pitching machine that would throw random pitches, and you could actually pick up which pitch was going to be thrown based upon the sound of the pitching machine and how the sound changed. And so the question becomes too, within this study, would the hitters, if they were worried about the hitters picking up the change in the pitching machine, was that actually playing a factor as well into the results that they were getting? Which I think is interesting if we're talking about it from an ecological perspective and different cues that hitters will utilize to help give them an advantage for anticipating a pitch. So that, I guess, is something that's interesting to note in the study design.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good point. I've always said, human beings are really lazy learners. If you give them any kind of cue that they can. So it is possible, you're right. If there was a sound difference, that even in the random condition where they didn't tell you the pitch, you knew it anyway from this kind of false cue. But that's a really good point. Yeah.
Going back to, does it make sense to, break up the swing? I think it gives you the best chance to kind of compare, players, apples to apples. Although I think you have to, be aware that, how everyone swings the bat can be different. So there might be something that you miss, in between these certain phases or certain checkpoints that makes a hitter successful when you decide to chunk the swing together.
Yeah, I guess the question becomes, what are the invariant features of hitters that you could potentially break these up into? Because Rob, I know you also used maybe some similar things in one of your studies, at least in terms of timing and the different timings of hitters' swings and different components of it. So I was also be curious your thoughts on these.
Yeah, I think Brock puts it really well. I'm doing some new analyses now on that big training study I did a couple years ago, and I'm finding the weighting, the loading of the weighting and putting it onto your forward, loading and putting it onto your front foot is really, really what's dividing batters of different skill level and what's changed during training and what allows you to hit different types of pitches. But I think how they exactly do that is different between batters. Like how you hold your weight back is done different ways. There's individual different ways. So I think it's useful, but it doesn't mean everybody's doing this exact same pattern of a swing. But you're right. I think what are these, like everybody lifts their foot at least a little bit. Everybody shifts their weight back. Everybody shifts their weight forward, right? There are some invariant features. I think that's a good way to put it too.
And what's interesting too, because there was a conversation on Twitter with regards to how guys adjust, and this is where I'm curious how the findings in this study plus Katsumata's 2007 study of the weighting, because it seems as though guys will, on off-speed pitches, they will land with a more soft front knee, and they'll kind of drift forward, so to speak, into their lead leg before they begin to firm up and straighten that leg. And my assumption, without actually having seen a lot of force plate data on this, then you would start to see, as they start to firm up the front side, an increase or your peak force output on the lead leg at that point. So to me, it's interesting to see. And this is where I was also curious, your thoughts. Katsumata, I thought, said that the timing of when they put their foot down is very consistent, whereas the findings here spoke to they tend to vary more, and that it had more to do with the pelvis than the actual weighting, which seemed to be the findings in Katsumata, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think so. So to your first point, I think you're exactly right. That's kind of what I was getting at with people doing it in different ways. So holding your weight back for an off-speed pitch, some people keep their foot up in the air and hold it back longer. Then you get that sharp spike like in the bottom of that figure, where you suddenly get that peak in the ground reaction force. Other people, you're right, land softly, and then that peak is just going to go up slowly. So what they're measuring there, you can see in the top figure, is when it hits 50% of your body weight, the force. So you can either delay it, they're both going to hit the 50% mark at the same time, either by keeping your foot in the air or doing that soft. So there's different ways to achieve that holding back of force, for depending on the batter. I think that's a good point. But yeah, that is an interesting. We'll get, maybe when we get to those things, I'll remember that. I have to remember that one. Any more? Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, it's almost like again, I'm usually thinking of the training implications of that. And it would almost be, could you take some of this type of approach and you're measuring some of those things and really practice getting fooled? In other words, the trials we're interested in here are the ones where it's not what we say it's going to be, or what you're come to expect. And what we want to do is measure, your force plate and your K vest and whatever you happen to be using, that not necessarily speaking specifically about the study, but what's being used these days. So that you're actually training people to be fooled, training them to maybe not have an ideal weight shift. I mean, the classic is, like A-Rod would talk about, okay, if you're fooled on a curveball, you can still do something with it if you keep your front knee behind your front foot. So yeah, you're going to drift because your timing has been fooled. But if you keep your, that was the visual or the field, people might want to call it. Who knows whether he was actually doing it or not, But if you could keep that front knee from going out in front of the front foot, you still could be in a position to do something with the ball. And so, it's almost like, okay, we practice all the time, knowing, kind of getting it right, knowing what's coming. Okay, let's practice being fooled. We're going to set you up to be fooled. Now make a good swing, make a good bat speed or whatever metric you're using in the fool condition.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Peter. That in my presentations I've been given lately, I've been using this phrase: error correction is the athlete's job, not the coach's. Right, and so even the best hitter in the world is going to be out in front sometimes, and foot in the bucket, whatever you want to call it. So you have to be able to learn to adjust parts of your swing to, when you get it wrong and you're fooled, right? You can't coach that completely gone, right? So you have to be able to adjust and be adaptable if you're going to be a good hitter. So you're right. You have to train for that and learn how to do it. And obviously in your stuff, Peter, recognizing the pitch earlier, pitch recognition is going to help you do all this stuff more effectively. Yeah.
I think that just to follow up on that, like in game, obviously it's up to the athlete to correct the error. Kind of like what Peter's saying, from a coaching standpoint, it's our job to develop environments that will help them improve that kind of error correction. But it's also our job of coaches to understand the varying levels of how successfully a player can correct his error. And then it goes back to kind of like we were talking about earlier, is advanced information through like a probabilistic lens. The guys that are better at correcting their own errors, they can kind of afford to sell out for a certain pitch more because they have more adjustability or error correction baked into their swing, whereas a player that doesn't have as much adjustability, he might need to kind of have an approach that's more 50-50, like not quite sell out for a certain pitch as much.
No, that's
Brock. If you think of a hitter fitting that profile, you kind of think of maybe a Donaldson, who's got a lot of motion into that, and yet he's feeling it. He's soft with the foot, and he's kind of giving himself that chance. He's got a wide margin of error for somebody who's so ballistic in his swing. He builds into it. It seems like a wide margin of error.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if there are any other comments on kind of the design or method, maybe we can dive into the results. The results section is quite heavy in this paper. I found there's lots of different analyses. What I do when I look at results is I go right to the data. I really ignore the stats. I go, and please, if you do a state, like figures are always better than tables of numbers, right? You can easily understand. So I go right. So I just kind of pull out the figures and then I go back and read the stats and see kind of what they found. And so if I put one up here, where's the first one? So this is, Another challenging thing I didn't mention the methods. This is something I struggled with for a long time when I was doing my first studies, is when you are trying to calculate a timing error, right? You need to make a decision about where the batter meant to hit the ball, right? You know what I mean? So you can be really late, and if you get the right combination of pitches, you can contact the ball perfectly, right? So to calculate a strict timing error, you have to assume that the batter's trying to hit the ball at a certain point in space, which is kind of a dubious design. And that's kind of what they tried to do in this study. We can talk about this, but so what this is timing error for the swings. The continuity condition is when they had in each block, every pitch was the same. The open condition is when they had the random order, and in both of these cases, I think the pitches were told beforehand what the pitch was going to be, right? And all you see here, what they're showing here is a sequencing effect. So if you go from a fastball to a fastball curve, I think this one, when you're informed in advance. What they're showing here basically is when you're informed in advance about the pitch, it doesn't matter whether they're all the same pitch or they're in random, kind of pseudo-random sequence. Is that what kind of anyone else want to comment on? I think this was kind of the first finding.
Yeah, so how they measured their timing error in the study, according to the study, they calculate the horizontal impact location relative to the body. So that's how they calculate that. But going into it, it's kind of like we can see that from this graph that it looks like that the continuity appears to have a lower timing error for at least fastballs and curveballs, which I find interesting because I feel like that kind of builds into movement patterns, because once you get the same pitch over and over again, you start to have that adjustability, saying, okay, this pitch is coming. Whereas, in that random sequencing, you may see the pitch once more after you saw it again, in terms of consecutive times, but it's so random that you have to adjust. So one pitch you might be seeing a fastball, you have to move your body for a fastball, whereas with a curveball, you have to move your body certain different ways. So I kind of find that interesting, where in this there's a little bit less timing error with continuity, because again, you're getting that same pitch over and over again, whereas with open, it's a little bit different. But I find that interesting for fast curveball, that it's less there, but whereas with a slow pitch, it's more open. So I think with that, you get you afford more time to be able to correct and adjust your mechanics or your movement.
Yeah. The other thing that I take from this graph is, so the timing errors there are shown in milliseconds. The number I've always used in my studies and things is plus or minus 9 milliseconds is the range for successful batting. I think Terry Bayhill calculated that. So these are all that's why they hit the ball. Looks like to me they're always late on the fastball and always early on the slow ball. For some reason, even when they're in the blocked condition, which seems weird. And even it's not like they're super fast pitches either. So I don't know if that was anything found interesting. But
well, and two, on this, what I found interesting on the methodological side too was the fact that they verbally said whether or not they were early, late, or on time. And I thought that was interesting, because that also, I think, kind of plays into this as well. And when you're talking about how they decided, where the location was kind of supposed to be. And two, with the results, finding that between the continuous and open condition, there wasn't that great of a difference between their error rate. Was pretty close to being the same, which tells me that even if you know what's coming, you're still not going to be perfectly timed up and optimal. And so, which is, if we go back to kind of your carrot for this conversation being the Astros, what was going on with the Astros, you would still see pitches where they knew it was coming and they'd fall it off or still swing and miss. And so to me, this just goes to show, like, hitting is hard. Even if you have the same pitch come at you over and over again, you're still going to have an error rate. And so, even with the advanced information, it only gives you a slight edge over, as we'll get into, over just not knowing. But it doesn't have any greater effect than just having the same pitch being thrown to you over and over again.
Oh, that's a really good point, right? Obviously, even if you know exactly what's coming, hitting is still really, really hard. Maybe I'll go to the next one. Let's see. So basically, yeah, this is just showing, in these two comparisons, there wasn't really much of an effect of them being blocked versus kind of the pseudo random order. This one is the one where they were looking at the when they're just showing you, this is when they're adding in the other condition. So the other one was comparing, I got to go back. The names are confusing to me. So continuity and open, they both knew what types of pitches were coming. This one is showing open versus random. Remember, in random is when you have this pseudo-random sequence of pitches and you're not telling the batter beforehand what to hit, what's coming. You're just telling them to sit on the fastball. And now in this figure, what you're seeing is there's a significant difference between when you know what's coming and when you don't, in terms of timing error for all three types of pitches. So the fastball is looks like about 5 milliseconds difference in the timing error when you know what's coming in the open condition versus when you don't know what's coming in the random condition.
And it, too, like, at least how I understood it, the continuous condition was kind of like the control condition, in the sense that it was supposed to mimic batting practice of usually you get a blocked set of pitches. So all fastballs, all curveballs, all changeups as an example. But I also like, just even looking at this, I think it's interesting that when you know a curveball is coming, it seems that you actually tend to be more late than early. But there are other parts of the results that kind of spoke to curveballs being an interesting, or how a hitter responds to a curveball in relation to other pitches is different, so to speak, than a fastball versus a pitch that's slower. And two, I guess, do we talk about and mention how like there wasn't as much movement? I think, Brock, you talked about that, about how like the pitch movement wasn't as much a part of this study. The exception being the fact that we have a curveball is the only pitch within this that has like any sort of actual movement. And I wonder how much that plays into the results that we see here with that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's why they call it a slow ball instead of a changeup, right? Because literally it's just a different speed. It doesn't have any other kind of action that people put on changeups.
Right. And I think kind of going back to maybe the previous slide and like the effectiveness of sequencing, I think that maybe it's the sequencing effect has more to do with like the interceptive ability of the player opposed to the actual timing of the player. So you can still be on time without making a successful swing. And so like, I think there's probably like, that's where like you get the most bang for your buck as far as a pitcher being able to put together a bunch of, like good pitch sequences together, because those movement profiles, that's what's really fooling the hitter, not necessarily, with the timing, but with where they are predicting the ball to be and where they think their bat needs to be to intercept the ball.
Yeah. And to that point, Brock, like the hitter needs to understand like where the ball is in relationship to them. And I think that's a huge component, too. And yeah, so.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Like, so you could if you sequence a curveball with a high fastball, the batter could be perfectly on time on the fastball, but pop it up, right? Because they still missed the pitch, yeah, which is not being captured at all here. Yeah,
exactly.
So this is, I think, one of the take-home messages of this paper is that when you know what pitch is coming, all else being equal, your timing error is lower, right? That's one of them. This is the other one I put up. This is the sequencing effect that they kind of didn't replicate. So in my previous study, I found that. So what they're looking at here is how well do you hit a fastball when you've had a fastball on the previous pitch versus a curveball on the previous pitch versus a changeup on the previous pitch. And what they're really showing is there's no effect at all of what happened on N-1 pitch for the N pitch. There's no real difference in performance, which they say is different from what I found and different from the intuition of baseball. In my study, I actually looked at 2 or 3 pitches before. So I think that's part of the difference. When you throw 2 fastballs and then a changeup, it messes people up, versus just 1 pitch before. So I think that's part of what's going on here. Did anyone else? So the sequencing in their study really had very, very little effect.
I think that would be my question, is like how many pitches of the same thing in a row before you introduce something different, and at what point does that have the greatest impact on messing up somebody's timing? And so I'm curious. So you did 2 pitches before?
I did, 2 or 3 sequences of 3 pitches. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. How did you determine, come to that number? What helped you decide to look at that?
I think I just looked at time, like segments of, the other thing that really complicates this and you need to take is obviously the count, right? Mm-hmm. So people not only look at sequence, but as you get more pitcher gets behind in the count, the probability of fastball goes up. So you get these two interacting factors. But yeah, I think in my study, I just looked at how far back you needed to go to find this kind of effect of sequencing. And for mine, mine was when you take everything kind of else out, there's effect of the two previous pitches. But it did depend on how you put them together. It wasn't just any combination. Yeah.
Where did you kind of pull that data from? Like, how did you determine that? Because I think that's kind of what's interesting is to, how do you parse out how many previous pitches or the sequence? Because in essence, that is the whole question of the study is sequencing. And how would you better design a study to parse out the sequencing effect?
Yeah, I don't know. I think to me it's hard to. I think they would need to look at longer segments of pitches and look at. So they really designed it so you could only compare. That you were like you were saying at the start. It's not perfectly random. They were making sure there was lots of fast, but you really would need a longer sequence of pitches. I think. I also think. Telling people to sit on the fastball, I would rather not give any instruction at all and see what they do instead of, I thought that was kind of leading people. In my study, I didn't do that. So, but I think the main thing they would need to do is look at longer segments, a bit longer, which I don't think they could quite do in their study. They don't have enough data.
I think it'd be best to kind of imagine that this was, like, in a hitter's count, right? If they're having to sit on fastball. So it's like, how would these hitters react with a timing error in a hitter's count?
Yeah, maybe that's why they did that. That's a good point, Brock. Kind of take that as a factor out.
And to Brock's point, that's oftentimes what a lot of coaches or hitting coaches will tell hitters is to sit on the fastball and to be ready for fastball timing and then adjust off speed. So I think there might be a little bit of merit in actually that component being in there, because that is a realistic thing that a constraint that coaches would put on hitters.
Right. And that's an important point.
Building off of too.
What Garrett's saying about putting the constraint on the hitters. So he's obviously talking about a practice situation. So if we look at the findings and their modeling and everything else related to performance, it has all kinds of deficiencies. And that would limit its, you're saying, okay, how does it describe what's really happening in a high level hitting situation? On the other hand, if we're saying, what are the implications of this for practice? As Garrett's going to, well, now they're pretty clear, because that's a much more reduced thing. And so it's like, okay, we've got the bat sensor on you. We've got the Rapsodo. Here's 5 fastballs. When you get you're producing consistent numbers on that. Now, you're going to get 2 fastballs and a curveball, and what you want to do is get so you can produce your consistent numbers for that too. Or you say, here's 5 curves, get your consistent number on that. Now, rather than blocking it out like that, when we can do 2 of one and then the alternative, 2 of one and then the alternative, then switch it around, 2 of one and then the alternative, you're scaffolding somebody closer and closer to that. But really, it's not a pitch recognition thing, but it's an adjustability. You're trying to, just increase the constraints, increase they're not getting 5 blocked trials to perfect their curveball swing. But you're also not making them guess. Ultimately, you'd get to the point where you could go one and then the other one, or you could then introduce a third pitch. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, or we're going to go 3, 2, 1, kind of fastball, curveball change or whatever. And when somebody is able to overcome that variability to produce the consistent practice swing, then you've had a good outcome. You're not worried really about the game situation at all. You're just doing the steady here and the whole thing, really trying to apply it to a practice setting.
Yeah, no, that's good point, Peter. I was just looking again. There's something about this data that kind of makes me again, people are always late on the fastball and always early on the slow pitch. If you took out the curve, I wonder, like, it's like people are making one swing for every pitch, and it's just the pitch type is determining the error. They're doing this. This is kind of the pattern you would expect if people made the same pitch swing on every pitch. So but I'd have to calculate, but something seems a bit weird about that, but I don't know. I have to dig deeper. But, I guess the next kind of data that looked at was looking at the, actual segments of the swing, breaking it into those phases. Did I miss something, or did they dropped the conditions at this point, right? They didn't look at how the random versus continuity versus open affected the phases of the swing.
They switched to the groups that I was talking about, whether it was early, on time, or late.
Yeah. So what did they do for that?
They're just looking at, I would assume, when the kinematics occurred in each of those conditions of early, acceptable, or late. So, like, if it's a diamond, they were on time. If it was a triangle, they were late. And if it's a circle, they were early. And so I guess they're doing a comparison of the kinematic sequence for when they were on time or they had an error, so to speak.
And that's from the swing. That's what I found kind of strange. You have all this super fancy equipment, and then you're categorizing in huge, lumping all the late swings together, all the acceptable and all the early together. I found kind of a strange, but you're right. I think that's what they did. So they took the swing errors and lumped them into one of these three groups. And this was based on this wasn't based on people's judgments, right? Because someone mentioned, right, people were saying whether they thought there was a good swing, but I think this is different, if I remember.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how they then determined the early, acceptable, and late, other than they said that they went off of what the person said.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I thought they were using that as the benchmark for whether or not they would categorize the timing as early, acceptable, or late. So they were letting them self-report like where acceptable was, and then they were measuring off of that.
Which I think has huge issues.
Right. I mean, how effective are hitters actually at being able to tell, their own timing? Like, that's a huge question mark to me.
Yeah, I agree.
It's like you said, you can manipulate your actual timing in order to hit the ball perfectly, or what they think is at the perfect spot. So whether they were actually early or late is kind of up in the air, but how they were able to adjust to hit the ball at an optimal spot could really be what was going on.
Which I think is hard to tell from the standpoint of you can be late, hit the ball late, and still square it up and have good exit velocity, good launch angle, and have a positive result. And so that's where, I think a lot of coaches, we do get on like, well, were you early or late or on time? But oftentimes to me, it's, can you square the ball up and hit it well late all the way to early? Like, you need to be able to hit the ball well through that entire range, not so much whether or not you hit it at the optimal location, but rather that in terms of space, front to back in terms of the plate, but more, did you hit it on the optimal location on the barrel to produce, the desirable batted ball outcome?
Yeah, I think that's
good. And that's like, that's scaled too, right? If we hit the ball at the most optimal part on the plate, but we are not as accurate with where we're hitting it on the barrel, then there's a slight error to that. But if we, like you said, if we're a little early or late, but we hit it, perfectly on the sweet spot, then, it makes up for that too. So it's kind of a sliding scale for both of those characteristics.
Yeah. There's something I point out. This would be like a little advice I give people if they're doing in this kind of analysis, whenever you're doing this kind of analysis where you're looking at the phases of the swing or how it unfolds, I would always plot it both in terms of time to impact that they have here, but also time after release, right? Because I think some phases of the swing are adjusted relative to when the ball's released. And some of them are adjusted to when, so you get kind of a different story. But like, so what we're seeing in this figure, for me, I'm seeing that you get this shift, this temporal shift of all the phases of the swing about equal. This is again weird. I keep bringing this point up, but you look at the fastball. They're never early on the fastball. There's no early swings on a 76 mile an hour. There's no circles, and there's, unless they just left those points off, they're never late on the other pitches. Or there's just, I don't know if this is just not including those plots.
They
points.
Did drop a section of the data. I don't remember which part, but they did drop some stuff out. I remember them saying that they just didn't, it wasn't significant. Maybe that part of the data was not significant, and they just dropped it from the analysis.
Yeah.
Maybe I missed this in the design, but did it say how far the pitching machine was from the plate?
17 meters. I was going to convert that, and I never did.
I think that's pretty close to what I use. I think that's roughly what the release point of a normal, typical size pitcher would be.
It's 55 feet.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's usually what I use. So it's not the actual pitcher mound, it's the release point.
I was just making sure that if it was closer than like the actual release point, then 76 wouldn't feel quite as slow. But if it is like you said, the scalable release point, then obviously, 76 is extremely slow for a fastball.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say this figure to me is more interesting because it's looking at how, so this is a plot of how the different phases of the swing are adjusted for different pitch types. And now we're getting something. This is, to me, it was the most interesting part of this is kind of where you're talking about the Katsumata data, Garrett, I think, showing how people are adjusting their swing when they're hitting a fastball versus a curveball. And it's not just doing all parts of the swing the same. I think what you're saying, Garrett, maybe the loading on the front foot, the stepping on the front foot, batters seem to do that the same for every pitch. Most batters. There's not like you do a shorter stride or a quicker stride for one type, which makes sense. It's too early, right? You don't know what the pitch type is usually when you're doing that. It's going to be the weight shift and the pelvis turn and things like that you're going to adjust.
Well, it seemed as though, at least in Katsuma's study, that was the invariant feature that they found, and which I guess in some ways makes sense because it's much harder it's more work to think about when to put your foot down than it is to just adjust somewhere else. So that was at least my take on that from that study. But whereas this one seems to indicate there was difference or variation in when they actually put their foot down, it appeared to me.
Yeah, in this figure, Peter, where's pitch recognition happening? Like time to, is it 200?
I think that pitch recognition can happen all the way through that swing. I mean, in the Mueller and Abernethy model, you've got early recognition cues that lead to bottom half adjustments, large muscle adjustments, and then you can be making hand adjustments right up until probably that 5 to 7 feet in front of the plate. That's why they talk about going into the shoebox, right? Because you can only make late adjustments. You can make some big adjustments early, but by the time you've started your turn or your pelvis turn there, you're only going to be able to make hand adjustments that are, plus or minus a ball width. So you've got three ball widths of height maybe on there. I think you can recognize all. It's not serial. Mm-hmm. It's not recognize and then adjust.
Yeah,
you're going to recognize, adjust, boom.
No,
through that. Kind of looking back on the earlier one, thinking of coaches trying to apply this, the consistency that they had in that could be kind of interesting because Brock, you might walk out there and say, okay, today we're going to practice being late. And here are some conditions. I give you this instruction, sit on the fastball. I know from the experience, I do this set of things, and it makes hitters kind of be late. You say, don't worry about being late. This is not a timing drill. This is a drill to practice getting a good, a good contact on the ball when you are late. So it's valuable to say that would be a takeaway I would take from this. I would say, okay, what can I go out and set up some conditions? And Garret had mentioned that, that's our job, to set the conditions of learning. We can't make the learning happen. Set the conditions so that they figure it out with their mind and body and eyes. That suggests that if we can have some set of things with a pitching machine and maybe instructions to them, whatever it is, that consistently produces late or early swings, hey, we can use that to practice that very, very thing.
Yeah, I think I would probably try to create an environment that would make them late, opposed to have them internally think about trying to be late. So for example, provide an environment where there's a lot of slow pitches, and then, mix in a random fastball, and then just see the success of, are they able to adjust to that fastball that they weren't expecting, opposed to maybe them internally trying to make themselves late or early. Because I think that's kind of harder to do. I think it's so against of everything that you try to practice, right? Because we're always trying to be on time, so trying to get them to do that would be harder. So I guess I would try to create an environment where we can try to measure what they do when they are late.
Yeah, no, I think there's some really good points there, and to both your points, to me this demonstrates a point I try to make to people. You can't just, in a baseball swing, you can't perceive then act, right? You can't wait until you know what's coming, where it's going to be, then swing. There's not enough time for that. You have to be perceiving and acting all at the same time. They have to be happening simultaneously. And that's, I think, what your point, getting people to adjust on the fly at different points of the swing. And I think drills, sometimes I like occlusion drills for that. So you start occluded, and then you open it up after the ball's already on the way, and they have to kind of adjust and they can't wait until they know what's coming to hit the ball. But I think those are great training ideas, definitely.
Yeah, I really like Gibson.
Yes, you caught the reference there. You caught the keep it coupled reference there, huh? Any more thoughts on kind of the results of this? So I think there's I think there's some interesting things, but I think there's enough, the things we pointed out about the pitching machine and the conditions. I don't know what you can take out of this in terms of practicality. Obviously, knowing what's coming helps. I don't think, to me, this doesn't convincingly demonstrate that sequencing doesn't affect hit timing. To me, I don't think that. But maybe this kind of stuff, looking at how people adjust, is the most interesting part to me, and where you can take this. I don't know what your guys' thoughts are.
I mean, I think a huge limitation is the mere fact that they used a pitching machine. And so the question becomes, especially to me, what is the most specifying information? Is it the fact that, does it come from the pitcher and the pre-pitch kinematics, or is it ball flight? So what you were saying, Rob, of occluding and then the early part, and then just having the ball flight information, does that provide more specifying information, or is it the third option, which would be a combination of the two? But that's kind of where, after looking at this research, my next question becomes, where is the specifying information for the hitter to connect to, and where are those sources?
Any other thoughts? Anyone on the? I think obviously this. I think this some point ways makes the message that a lot of people are adopting, that using the same settings on a pitching machine over and over is not a good way to train. You need to add variability to teach this adjustability we're talking about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, any more concluding thoughts? Anyone? Before we sign off, I'm going to ask you guys about the stuff you have going on, but I didn't know if anyone had any more on this paper. No? Okay.
No, just thanks for calling out the discussion group on that, Rob. I think that's really interesting. And again, I say, to me, the most interesting implications are for practice design, and not necessarily the basic research of trying to understand what's going on perceptually in that black box. But if we come up with ways of structuring that, kind of like what Brock was saying, if we can say, hey, we're going to do these things, and rather than saying, oh, you try to be late, you say, hey, we're going to do some things here. It's probably going to make you late on your swing. Don't worry about it. What we're practicing today is making good contact when you're late on your swing. Another day, it's early on the swing. And so it's not, oh, should we use pitching machines to practice? We're going to use pitching machines to practice. But if we can get really targeted with what we do with them, adjusting those constraints, adjusting the goals, adjusting the constraints, so that, oh, you're just working on this piece here, then, that might be of value.
Yeah. No, I agree. I like how you pull that kind of stuff out from it. So, yeah, I thought we'd give a chance. Robert, Brock, and Garrett, I thought I'd give a chance for anyone listening who hasn't found your podcast yet. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about it and maybe what you guys are planning with it. That it's Finding the Edge podcast, right?
Mm-hmm. Which Brock came up with the title of that when we were doing our first episode. And the main purpose or intention behind the podcast is to discuss motor learning theories as well as data analytics and how those two things can coincide together, especially when it comes to baseball. Rob, your podcast is awesome, but it also covers a wide variety of different topics outside of baseball. And so our goal was to actually have a podcast that was focused specifically around baseball and those ideas that you cover.
Oh, yeah. No, I think it was a great idea. You're right. I think pulling in the analytics piece is different than I do. And I think there's room for lots of these. and definitely, no, I think it's really enjoying it. And Robert, you're joining them full time now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brock is now busy with the Brewers.
Yeah.
Yep. So I unfortunately can't join on the podcast. Just got a lot of different stuff going on. But definitely have been listening to the couple episodes that Robert's been on so far. And he definitely provides an extremely unique perspective. And he's also an extremely talented analyst. So kind of like Garrett was saying, like being able to take, kind of the ecological dynamics and have that as the framework, but also being able to analyze like the success of like how we're designing these environments, I think is kind of where the sauce is, at least in my opinion. So it's always good stuff.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. And I was going to ask Peter, I think you were going to say it, but I was going to ask you.
I was just going to say I have to step off because my dean is
okay. Go for it.
For another,
we got stacks of this.
But I really appreciate it. You guys were great. I've loved the podcast. We've talked to them on the side.
Yeah.
Love the show and everything you bring to it, Rob. So thanks a lot to all of you. Robert, good to meet you.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this, guys. Okay. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for the fun discussion, and definitely be sure to check out the Finding the Edge podcast if you haven't already. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.
Cut you